The Civil Rights Movement, Actions and Obstacles. 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education. One of the first actions in the Civil Rights Movement centered on trying to end segregation in the schools. Glenda Brown, an 8-year-old, was denied access to an all-white school, which was only a few blocks from her home. She attended an all-black school. Along the way to school, she had to cross a dangerous railroad yard and then take a bus for 21 blocks to reach her school. Her father, along with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, sued. Putting some cases together, the Supreme Court unanimously agreed that schools should be integrating, ruling that separate schools, were not equal. Many southern states refused to comply with the ruling, so a year later the Supreme Court ordered school authorities in the South to make a prompt and reasonable start towards carrying out the decision with all deliberate speed. Still, many schools refused to change and to integrate. The term disobedience often brings misbehavior to mind. This certainly looks like some fun disobedience. But in the civil rights world, it has an entirely different meaning. While the courts had given the civil rights movement a major win in schools, other tactics were needed to make more gains. This time, the movement focused on taking direct action, agitate and demonstrate, through civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is choosing to break a law that is unfair. It is a choice by the protester and consciously done. The protester understands that they may face arrest and jail. Additionally, following in Gandhi's footsteps and Martin Luther King's beliefs, protesters in the African American movement were nonviolent and peacefully protested. They trained their protesters on how to deal with physical threats during a protest and came up with guidelines to help protesters remain peaceful. I'm not sure if I could do it. Everybody loves a good mugshot. Who knew that a mugshot of Rosa Parks would help to launch the civil rights movement? 1956, the Montgomery bus boycott. On December 1st, 1955, seamstress Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat for a white person and was arrested. She was a secretary for the NAACP and had attended training for activists. In response to Parks' arrest, a boycott of the busing system began. As it grew, many other leaders gave their support to the boycott, including the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and Martin Luther King. The black community of Montgomery made up about 70% of the bus company's customers, so a boycott would hurt the company financially. Although they faced intimidation, the boycott continued with regular meetings, carpools, and the help of reduced taxi fares. After 381 days, the boycott was successful, and Montgomery buses were integrated. The Supreme Court had ruled that segregated buses were illegal in December of 1956. The civil rights movement had just had its first major protest against segregation, and another win. Unfortunately, this was met with violence. Sharpshooters shot at passengers, and members of the Ku Klux Klan began a bombing campaign against churches where protests had been organized and the homes of civil rights leaders. By the end of the boycott, the fight for civil rights for African Americans had gained national attention. Rosa Parks was seen as the mother of a movement, and Martin Luther King was now a national civil rights leader. On most first days of school, students are escorted by their parents or met by friends. Can you imagine being denied entries by soldiers? That's what happened to Little Rock Nine, and here's what they saw on their first day of school at Central High School. 1957, the Little Rock Nine. Although the Supreme Court had ruled segregation of the schools illegal in Brown versus the Board of Education, it did not happen immediately. The first major battleground for integrating the schools was Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. To follow the Brown ruling, Little Rock School Board in Arkansas came up with a plan to integrate its schools. After careful vetting by the NAACP, 9 students were selected to go to Central High School and trained carefully on how to respond to harassment. Governor Faubus ordered the Arkansas National Guard to prevent them from entering to protect the students from the crowd outside. Little Rock Nine were met by a mob that was protesting against integration. Federal Judge Davis ordered the guard to be removed and to let the Little Rock Nine in. And to protect the Little Rock Nine, President Eisenhower placed federal troops at the high school for the rest of the year, showing that the federal government would support the Brown decision and enforce it. Although they faced harassment and sometimes violence throughout the year, the Little Rock Nine continued to go to school and successfully integrated Central High School. Ernest Green became the first African American to graduate. But Faubus still didn't stop his opposition. He closed all of Little Rock's high schools the next year to stop integration, and only a court order would reopen them later. Lunch. It's probably your favorite class because you get to hang out with your friends and so on. But having lunch with other friends and students isn't always a fun proposition. Just ask the Greensboro Four, who had tried to have lunch at a lunch counter in Woolworths. 1960 sit-ins. Inspired by Martin Luther King Jr.'s methods of nonviolent protest, 4 college students at the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University decided to protest segregation. On February 1, 1960, they sat down at a lunch counter in Woolworths and ordered coffee. Management refused to serve them, following the segregation laws. The students remained at the counter until the store closed. Television stations covered the protest. They returned the next day with more students. They sat quietly that day, and the next and the next. Despite being taunted, elbowed, jostled, and shoved, they remained nonviolent. Within 4 days, 300 students had joined the sit-ins. Television coverage increased, and within 2 weeks, the sit-in movement had spread to 55 cities across other lunch counters in the South. Many protesters risked arrest for charges such as disturbing the peace or disorderly conduct. It became a model for other protests against segregation. In a similar fashion, sleep-ins were done in motel lobbies, play-ins were held in parks, read-ins in libraries, and watch-ins with movies, and many, many more. Within 6 months, Woolworth's store in Greensboro desegregated, along with hundreds of other facilities in the South. The sit-ins showed how important nonviolence could be and made student leaders in the movement.